You are not Mama. Where is Mama?
She's at the hospital.
The city of Toronto in January was the kind of cold that made your bones remember they were mortal. Melissa knew this cold well. She had lived in Canada for 6 years, had traded the warm Georgia sunshine of her childhood for the gray, glittering promise of a career in one of the world's most competitive cities. She did not regret it, not even on mornings like this one, when she was bundling 3 4-year-olds into 3 separate winter coats at 6:30 in the morning while simultaneously answering emails on her phone with her chin. "Mama, Kobe won't share the red mitten," announced Zara, the eldest of the triplets, by 4 minutes, standing with her hands on her tiny hips in a posture so authoritative it made Melissa's heart squeeze with helpless love. "Kobe," Melissa said, not looking up from her phone. "I found it first," said Kobe. "Kai, come here, baby, let me zip you up," Melissa said, tucking her phone under her arm and crouching down to her quietest child, who stood patiently waiting with the specific dignity of a child who had accepted that chaos was simply the weather of his family. She zipped his coat, kissed his forehead, confiscated the red mitten from Kobe, gave it to Zara, produced a blue mitten from her coat pocket for Kobe. She always had backup mittens. She was a woman who had learned to prepare for everything, and stood back up. 3 children. No husband. No family in Toronto. A salary that was extraordinary by any normal measure, which meant it was barely enough given Toronto's cost of living and the price of a good daycare that stayed open late. She worked for Park Ji-woo. This was either the greatest professional achievement of her life or a peculiar form of beautiful suffering, depending on the day. Park Ji-woo was 29 years old and had been called cold so many times by so many people that he had stopped feeling the sting of the word. He wore it now like a coat, fitting, impenetrable, expensive. He was the CEO of Park Industries, a conglomerate whose legal arms stretched across real estate, tech, and international finance. His illegal arms, the ones that the Toronto underworld knew about and the Toronto police suspected but could never quite pin, stretched further. He had come to Canada at 17 to study at the University of Toronto. He had stayed because his grandfather, the founder of the Park criminal empire, had decided that Canadian soil was fertile for expansion. By 23 he had absorbed both the legitimate and shadow businesses. By 26 he was a billionaire. By 29 he had mastered the art of making people feel simultaneously grateful to be in his presence and terrified to stay there too long. He was also, and this was the thing people mentioned in whispers, extraordinarily beautiful. Not handsome in the conventional, approachable way. Beautiful in the cold, carved, almost punishing way of someone who seemed assembled from the concept of perfection rather than from ordinary flesh. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes that caught light like obsidian. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten the mechanics of smiling somewhere around his 15th birthday. Melissa had worked for him for 2 years. In those 2 years she had managed his schedule across 4 time zones, translated his silences for confused business partners, learned the precise temperature at which he preferred his morning Americano, survived 3 separate incidents where she had witnessed things she was professionally obligated to pretend she had not seen, and raised 3 children largely alone in a city that moved too fast to notice when a single mother was quietly drowning. She was the only person in his employ who called him sir without flinching. She was the only one who, when he snapped at her during a particularly difficult merger negotiation, had looked him directly in the eye and said, calmly and with great dignity, "If you speak to me like that again, I will resign, and you will spend the rest of the week trying to figure out where I put the Nakamura files, which I promise you no one else in this building will be able to find." He had stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then he had said, "The Americano was 2 degrees too cold this morning," and walked away. Which, from Park Ji-woo, was practically an apology and also an acknowledgement that she had won. She had gone home that evening and let herself cry a little in the shower where the children couldn't hear, because some days the effort of being that strong was simply enormous. The pain started on a Tuesday. It was the kind of pain that Melissa, who had delivered 3 babies simultaneously and considered herself to have a genuinely heroic relationship with physical discomfort, initially dismissed. A dull ache in her lower right abdomen, persistent and annoying. She drank water. She took ibuprofen. She went to work. By Thursday she was moving more carefully, unconsciously protecting her right side. Zara, 4 years old and terrifyingly observant, said at dinner, "Mama, you keep holding your tummy," and Melissa said, "Mama's fine, baby, eat your rice." By Friday night, the pain had graduated from annoying to insistent. She put the children to bed at 8. The triplets slept in the same room still, in 3 small beds lined up like books on a shelf, and Melissa always stood in the doorway for a moment after they fell asleep, just looking at them because however hard everything was, This was also somehow the most she had ever felt of anything, and then she sat on the couch and acknowledged to herself that something might actually be wrong. She looked up her symptoms with the specific dread of a person who knows that Googling symptoms is a descent into madness, but cannot stop herself. Appendicitis. She read the list. She sat with it. The pain was bad enough now that she had to breathe through it. She thought about calling her friend Danielle, but Danielle was in Ottawa visiting family. She thought about calling the neighbor Mrs. Okafor, but it was nearly midnight. She thought about driving herself to the hospital, but she couldn't leave 3 4-year-olds alone, and she thought about calling a cab and bringing them with her, 3 sleepy children in a Toronto emergency room at midnight, and she thought, I need someone to sign for me. Something happens. If I need surgery, I need someone who can be with my children. In Canada, for her emergency contact, she had listed her sister in Atlanta. But her sister's number had changed 3 months ago and Melissa had updated it in her personal phone, but apparently, with the specific cruel comedy of a universe that liked to test people, not in her phone's synced work contact backup, which was the phone that had just died and was charging in the kitchen, which meant she was looking at her personal phone, which had been dropped by Kobe last week and had a cracked screen and was now being deeply uncooperative about loading her contacts properly. She scrolled. The screen glitched. Contacts shuffled. She hit the first number that said emergency contact in a slightly blurred save. She should have looked more carefully at the name above it. She hit call. In the Park Industries penthouse on the 48th floor of a glass tower downtown, a phone rang at 12:53 in the morning. Jeonwoo was asleep. One of the few genuinely human things about him was that he slept deeply and without apparent guilt, the sleep of someone whose conscience had reached a particular accommodation with the life he lived. The phone dragged him up from that depth in stages. He grabbed it, looked at the screen. Carter. His brow furrowed. His assistant called him at 1 in the morning only when something was catastrophically wrong with the business. He was already sitting up, already calculating, already preparing for crisis management. Carter, he said, his voice carrying that particular quality it had when he'd just woken, slightly rough, the careful shaping of his English just slightly softer. I'm sorry to call so late, sir, I really am. Her voice was wrong. He had spent 2 years learning the architecture of Melissa Carter's voice, its professional crispness, its occasional dry humor, its absolute refusal to crack under pressure. Right now it was cracking. I think I need to go to the hospital and I can't. The children are here and I don't. He was already standing. He was reaching for his clothes. What hospital? I haven't gone yet, I can't leave the address, he said. Your apartment address. I have it in my files. Don't move. He hung up. He dressed. He called his driver, who was accustomed to being called at unreasonable hours and was therefore mercifully swift. He was in the car 8 minutes after the call ended, the Toronto streets dark and winter-silvered, the car cutting through the empty city like a blade. He did not ask himself why he was doing this. He did not pause to consider whether this was appropriate, whether he should have sent someone else, or whether personal involvement with an employee's medical emergency crossed some professional line. He simply went, with the same decisive totality with which he did everything because Park Jeonwoo had decided, and therefore it would be done. Melissa opened her apartment door and immediately felt 2 things. Relief so profound it almost buckled her knees, and a strange embarrassment at the state of her apartment at 1 in the morning, which had 3 small pairs of boots by the door, crayon drawings on the refrigerator, and a toy fire truck in the middle of the living room floor. Jeonwoo stepped inside. He was wearing dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater, his hair slightly disheveled. She had never in 2 years seen his hair anything other than immaculate, and the small imperfection of it did something odd to her chest. He looked at her. Then he looked at the apartment. Then he looked at her again, really looked, with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and what he saw. She knew what he saw, she could feel it, the gray tinge of her brown skin, the way she was standing slightly sideways, guarding her right side, made his jaw tighten. You should have called sooner, he said. I called by accident, she said. I was trying to call my sister. Something moved through his expression, too fast to name. The children are sleeping? Yes. All 3. Pause. The pain spiked and she pressed her lips together and breathed through it and she saw him notice. Get your bag. I'll carry you if you make me wait. She almost laughed. Almost. She got her bag. In the emergency room, they moved with the specific efficiency of people who understood urgency. The triage nurse looked at Jeonwoo and then at Melissa and said, with the practiced neutrality of a person who had seen everything, relation to the patient? Jeonwoo said without pausing, husband. Melissa looked at him. He looked at the nurse. The nurse moved them through. The diagnosis came quickly: appendicitis, acute, requiring emergency surgery. The surgical consent form landed in front of Jianwoo, who was sitting in the chair beside Melissa's hospital bed with the rigid posture of a man who was accustomed to sitting in rooms where things happen to other people. He looked at the form. "I'll sign it," he said. "It should be a family," the nurse began. "I'm her husband," he said in the specific tone that had once made a room full of international crime bosses rearrange their seating quietly. The nurse moved on. He looked at Melissa. She was looking at him with those large, dark eyes, and she was frightened. He could see it. She was not good at hiding fear, even though she was excellent at hiding everything else, and she said, "The children." Jianwoo. It was the first time she had ever called him by his name, and she clearly didn't notice she'd done it. "My babies. I can't leave them alone in the apartment." "I'll go back," he said. "You don't have to." "Melissa." His voice was not unkind. It was simply absolute. "I'll go back. I'll be there when they wake up." She looked at him for a long moment. And then, because the anesthesia was already beginning to pull at the edges of her consciousness, and because she was more frightened than she wanted to admit, and because somewhere in 2 years of working with this cold, difficult, beautiful man she had apparently learned to trust him in some deep place she didn't have a name for, she said, "Zara likes her hair in 2 puffs. Kobe won't eat unless there's something orange on his plate. Kai will ask you 1,000 questions, and he needs you to answer all of them, even the strange ones." He said nothing. He picked up the surgical consent form and signed his name. Then he sat there until they came to take her to surgery, and he was still sitting there, straight-backed in the plastic chair, when they wheeled her out, and the last thing she saw before the doors swung closed was him watching her go, his face unreadable, his eyes very dark and very steady. He went back to her apartment. He had a key, and he let himself in. He stood in the middle of her small living room for a moment, in the dark, listening to the sleeping breath quiet of the apartment. He did not know how to do this. He knew how to run boardrooms and manage supply chains and make men considerably larger than himself quietly afraid. He did not know what to do with 3 sleeping 4-year-olds in a small Toronto apartment at 2:15 in the morning. He sat on Melissa's couch. He waited. At 6:47 he heard movement. Zara came out first. She stood in the hallway in her pajamas, small, beautiful, with her mother's eyes and a suspicious expression that she had also clearly inherited from her mother, and she stared at Jianwoo. "You're not Mama," she said. "No," he agreed. "Who are you?" "I work with your mother." Zara considered this. "Where is Mama?" "She's at the hospital. She wasn't feeling well. She'll be back soon." He paused. "She told me you like your hair in 2 puffs." Zara stared at him for a moment longer with the forensic intensity of a small child deciding something important. Then she said, "Can you make eggs?" He could not make eggs. He had not, in approximately a decade, made any food for himself that did not involve either a private chef or a restaurant. He looked at her. "Show me where things are," he said, "and I'll try." By the time Kobe and Kai emerged, both rumpled with sleep, there were eggs, slightly overcooked but edible, on 3 plates, and on each plate there was a slice of orange. He had found oranges in the refrigerator and deduced from Melissa's instruction their necessity, and Jianwoo was standing at the counter looking at the orange juice carton with the expression of a man who had just successfully defused something considerably more complicated than a bomb. Kai climbed onto a chair, looked at his plate, looked at Jianwoo and said, "Do fish dream?" Jianwoo sat down. "Scientists believe some fish may experience REM sleep," he said, "though whether that constitutes dreaming in the way humans experience it is still debated." Kai nodded, satisfied. He picked up his fork. He ate his eggs. Melissa came home 2 days later, moving carefully, sore and tired, and carrying an enormous amount of gratitude that she wasn't sure how to put down. She came home to find her apartment cleaner than she had left it, considerably cleaner. She would later learn this was because Jianwoo had called his housekeeping service at 7 in the morning of the first day, and 3 children who had, against every reasonable expectation, apparently bonded with her boss. Kobe had taught him to play a card game. Zara had talked him into watching 3 consecutive episodes of a cartoon that Melissa happened to know he had, at one point, described cartoons in general as an efficient method of manufacturing noise. Kai had asked him, apparently, whether the sky was a color or a light, and Jianwoo had explained atmospheric scattering in enough detail that Kai had needed to sit with it quietly for the rest of the afternoon. Melissa stood in her doorway, still in her hospital discharge clothes, and looked at the scene, her 3 children at the kitchen table with their coloring books, and Park Jianwoo sitting at the table with them, his expensive sweater sleeves pushed up, a red crayon in his hand. There was a red crayon in his hand, because Kai had apparently insisted he contribute to a drawing of a spaceship. He looked up and saw her. He put the crayon down with a dignity that suggested he intended to pretend the crayon had never existed. "Mama?" Three voices, three small bodies launching from chairs, and Melissa caught them as best she could, went down to her knees right there in the doorway, and held all three of them at once, pressed her face into the crown of Zara's head and breathed, and she cried a little. She couldn't help it, and she heard herself saying, "I'm here, I'm okay, Mama's okay." When she looked up, Jeonwoo was standing by the kitchen table, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not his professional mask. It was not his cold CEO armor. It was something unguarded and strange, something that made him look, for just a moment, like someone who had forgotten he wasn't supposed to feel things. He looked away before she could name it. "You should rest," he said. "I've stocked the refrigerator. I've arranged for Mrs. Okafor to help with the children for the next week. Take as much time as you need before returning to work." "Jeonwoo," she said. She was still on her knees on the floor, three children wrapped around her, and she looked up at him. "Thank you." He nodded once. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He left. He sat in the car for 4 minutes before he told his driver to go. She returned to work 12 days later, because she needed the income and because Jeonwoo's version of take your time had included making sure her full salary continued without question, which she only discovered when she checked her account and found herself sitting down heavily on the couch with her hand over her mouth. She walked into his office on a Monday morning with his Americano at exactly the right temperature and his Tuesday schedule printed and reorganized, and she set both on his desk and said, "Good morning, sir," in her crispest professional voice. He didn't look up from his laptop. "The Americano is exactly right," he said. Which was, she had learned how he said, "I'm glad you're back." But things were different now, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. He started leaving her office at reasonable hours instead of expecting her to stay until he was done. She started noticing that there were always fresh flowers in the hallway outside her office, and when she mentioned this to another assistant, she was told, with a significant look, that there had never been flowers in that hallway before. He stopped by her desk sometimes with no stated purpose, picking up a file and reading it while standing there for a few minutes, which was a new behavior entirely. She stopped pretending she didn't notice. One Thursday in March, he stopped in front of her desk and said, without preamble, "Kai asked me before I left whether space has a floor." She looked up from her computer. "What did you tell him?" "That the universe is so large the concept of a floor doesn't apply, but that the question itself is more sophisticated than it sounds." A beat. She smiled. It was a real one, the kind she usually reserved for her children, and it apparently did something to the air in the room because he stopped looking at the file and looked at her instead. "They're remarkable children," he said. "They are," she agreed. "You're raising them alone." It was not a question. She lifted her chin slightly, an instinct, that old pride, the one that had carried her from Atlanta to Toronto and through 2 years of this job. "Yes. That's..." He stopped. He set the file down. He said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words they don't entirely trust themselves with, "That's an extraordinary thing to do." She didn't know what to say to that. He had already turned and walked back to his office, his shoulder blades straight and his hands in his pockets, and she sat at her desk for a moment with her heart doing something complicated and inconvenient. He asked her to dinner in April. Not as a date. He would later freely admit, in his own way, that he was incapable of asking for things he wanted directly, that directness in wanting something was for him a form of vulnerability he had not been raised to access easily. So he asked her to accompany him to a client dinner, which was a normal work request, except that when they got there, the client had cancelled, and somehow Jeonwoo had not mentioned this and had instead reserved a table at Aloe, which was one of Toronto's finest restaurants, and had arranged for a private section. Melissa sat across from him at the beautiful table, looked at the menu and said, "The client cancelled." "Yes." "You knew before we left the office." A brief pause. "Yes. So this is..." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "This is a date," she said. He said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his version of yes. She looked back at the menu. She didn't smile because she didn't want to frighten him. "I'm having the scallops," she said. He exhaled very slightly. "Fine," he said. The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked, not about work, not about schedules and files and meetings, but about things she hadn't known he had inside him. His grandfather, the complicated love for a man who had built an empire with beautiful, ruthless hands. His time in Korea as a teenager, the weight of expectation. The way he had come to love Canada precisely for its indifference, for the way the city did not care who his family was and forced him to become himself. She told him about Georgia, about her mother's cooking, about the way she had decided on Toronto almost randomly, following a job offer, and the terrifying feeling that she needed to go somewhere no one knew her name and discover what she was made of. She told him about the triplets' father, briefly, without drama. A relationship that had not survived the news of 3 babies, a man who had simply decided he was not adequate to the size of that life. His loss, Jeon-woo said. Flatly. Factually. Like it was simply the objective assessment of someone who had seen her daughter's spine and her son's questions and her other son's patience. She looked at him across the candlelit table. In this light, his face was less a mask and more a landscape. All those sharp angles softened slightly, and there was something in his eyes that she had been noticing for weeks, a warmth that he seemed genuinely surprised to find himself in possession of. When the car dropped her home, he walked her to her building door. Not a request, simply a fact. He was there beside her on the pavement, and when she turned to say goodnight, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. Briefly. Warm. His hand came up and touched her jaw just for a second. "Good night, Melissa," he said and stepped back. She went inside and stood in her lobby for approximately 45 seconds before she started smiling. Their first real kiss happened on a Saturday. He had taken all 5 of them to the Toronto waterfront, which had been Zara's request and also clearly a test. Zara was running an ongoing evaluation of Park Jeon-woo's character, and she was 4 years old and utterly merciless about it. He had passed multiple checkpoints: the eggs, the crayon, answering Kai's questions, playing the card game with Kobe for 40 consecutive minutes, and apparently the waterfront visit was the next assessment. The children ran ahead. Jeon-woo and Melissa walked side by side, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. The lake was steel gray and enormous, the CN Tower behind them, the waterfront wind cold enough to make everyone's cheeks red. Melissa was watching Zara spin in circles near the railing and laughing, and she wasn't watching where she was going, and she stepped on a patch of ice and went sideways, and Jeon-woo's hand was there, completely without ceremony, as if he had been watching for exactly this contingency, and he caught her by the waist and she grabbed his arm, and they stood for a moment at a strange angle, her body pressed against his side, his arm firm and solid around her waist. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "I have you," he said. 3 words. Quiet. And somehow he wasn't only talking about the ice. He kissed her there in the Lake Ontario wind, with 3 4-year-olds 20 feet away, his cold hand warm against her face and his mouth gentle in a way she had not expected from someone so unyielding in every other dimension of his life. It was a careful kiss. Intentional. The kind of kiss a person gives when they have thought about it for a long time and want to do it correctly. When they broke apart, Zara was standing 3 feet away with her hands on her hips. "Are you kissing my mama?" she demanded. Jeon-woo looked at her with perfect composure. "Yes," he said. Zara evaluated him. "Are you going to do it again?" "I'd like to," he said. "With her permission." Zara turned to Melissa. "Mama?" Melissa was laughing, pressing her fingers to her mouth. "Go play, Zara." Zara looked at Jeon-woo one more time, then turned and ran back toward her brothers. "She approves," Melissa said. "I suspected she was the one whose approval mattered most," he said and took her hand. They were quiet about it, the way private people are. They did not announce it at work. They did not perform it for anyone. But he came to her apartment on Friday evenings and ate dinner with the children, and she came to his penthouse on the rare Saturday nights Mrs. Okafor sat with the triplets, and in those penthouse evenings she discovered that the cold billionaire kept a collection of jazz records and knew how to cook exactly one Korean dish, his grandmother's doenjang jjigae, and cried once, quietly, in the kitchen when he made it, and he told her about his grandmother with the careful words of a man who has never told anyone before. They went to Niagara Falls in June with the children, who were awestruck and immediately got their shoes wet despite being told not to, and Jeon-woo carried Kai on his shoulders for the rest of the afternoon without being asked. They went to a jazz club downtown in July, just the 2 of them, and danced for the first time. He was a formal dancer, trained in it like he was trained in everything, and she was a free dancer, raised on rhythm, and the combination was unexpectedly wonderful, her ease teaching his structure something, his structure giving her movement a frame. He kissed her in the car after the jazz club, longer than at the waterfront, less careful now, more certain. She pulled back and looked at him in the dark of the car and said, "You know this is complicated." "Yes," he said. "I have 3 children. Extraordinary ones," he said. "I believe I've mentioned that. I work for you. That," he said, "is a problem I'm prepared to solve several different ways." She looked at him. She loved him. She hadn't said it yet, but it was there, fully formed, taking up a considerable amount of space in her chest. "What are you, Jianwoo?" she asked softly. "What are the parts of your life I don't know about?" A long quiet. The car moved through Toronto's summer streets. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes. "There are parts," he said honestly. "I won't pretend there aren't. I will tell you everything you need to know. Nothing will touch you or the children. On that I am, absolute." She believed him. Not naively. Not without understanding what she was accepting. But she had seen him with her children, had seen him at 2 a.m. signing a surgical consent form, had seen him cry in his kitchen over soup his grandmother taught him to make, and she understood that whatever else Park Jian-woo was, he was a man who protected the things he loved with a totality that brooked absolutely no argument with the universe. In September she found the ring by accident. She was looking for a pen in his penthouse study, she was at his place for a Saturday evening, the children with Mrs. Okafor, and she had come in here meaning only to be there for a moment, and she opened the wrong drawer, and there was a small black velvet box and she did not open it. She was absolutely not the kind of person who would open it, but she held it for one long second and her hand was shaking. She put it back. She went back to the living room. She sat down. She picked up her wine. She stared at the middle distance. When he came back from the kitchen with a glass of water, he looked at her expression and something shifted in his. "You found the drawer?" he said. It was not a question. I was looking for a pen." "I know." He sat down beside her. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't have a plan yet." "For how to ask?" He looked at her. "I've been working on it." "How long have you had it?" she asked. 3 months. She stared at him. 3 months. "I wanted to do it correctly," he said, with the dignity of a man who does not appreciate being hurried on important matters. "Jian-woo. I needed it to be right." She set her wine down. She turned to face him fully. "Get the box," she said. "Melissa?" "Go get the box right now," she said, and she was laughing. He looked at her. He stood up. He went to the study. He came back with the box, which he held with the careful precision of someone carrying something irreplaceable, and he stood in front of where she sat on his couch and she watched his face, this face she loved, this carved, proud, beautiful face, and she saw it, what she always saw when he thought she wasn't looking. Everything he had never learned to say out loud, all of it, full and unprecedented and absolutely genuine. He went down on one knee. He opened the box. Inside was a ring it was stunning, it was a diamond set in dark gold in a shape that managed to look neither ostentatious nor understated, that looked somehow exactly like her, and she pressed her hand over her mouth. "I have been told," he said, "that I am cold, that I am difficult, that I am impossible to know." He paused. "I do not disagree with any of these assessments. But you," he stopped. He composed himself. She loved him so much in this moment that she could barely contain it. "You called me by accident at 1 a.m. and it changed everything. I have met you in the place where I keep everything real, and I don't intend to go back to the way it was before." He looked up at her. "Will you marry me? Melissa Carter. Will you let me be?" "Yes," she said. She didn't wait for the end of the sentence. "Jianwoo, yes." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were not entirely steady. She noticed and loved him desperately for it. She pulled him up from his knee and kissed him, and it was one of those kisses that doesn't feel like a beginning or an end but like a recognition, like two people finally saying, out loud, a thing they have both known for a long time. They told the children over breakfast the next morning. Jianwoo was there. She had stopped pretending to herself that these lines needed to be maintained in the way she had initially imagined. The children knew him. They had known him since the morning he'd made slightly overcooked eggs and discussed fish dreams, and they told them together. Zara said, "Does that mean you're going to live with us?" "You'd be living with me," Jianwoo said. "In a bigger place." Zara weighed this. "Is there a yard?" "There will be," he said. With complete certainty, as if yards were things that materialized upon request. In his world, this was essentially true. Kobe said, "Are you going to be our dad?" A silence. A significant one. Jianwoo looked at Kobe with an expression that Melissa had never seen on his face and would think about for years afterward. Something so open and careful and almost young, something that suggested that this question was the one he had been most afraid of and most hoping for simultaneously. "If you'll have me," he said. "It's your decision. All three of you." Kobe considered. He looked at his sisters, or rather at Zara, whose opinion was apparently also Kobe's opinion on matters this important. Zara had her arms crossed thinking. Then she uncrossed her arms and said with 4-year-old finality, Okay. She pointed at Jianwoo. But you have to come to our school play. I'll be in the front row, he said. He was in the front row at every school play for the next 14 years. They married in November. The wedding was in a venue on the waterfront, her insistence, their waterfront, where it had started, and it was both beautiful and slightly overwhelming, because Jianwoo's world was large and his associates were powerful and some of them were frightening, and Melissa had stood in her wedding dress in the preparation room and said to herself firmly, "You chose this man, all of him, and you are not afraid of anything," and then walked out and saw him standing at the altar. He was wearing dark charcoal, not black, and his hair was perfect, and his face was doing the thing where it was trying to be neutral but wasn't, and when he saw her come through the doors, everything in his expression went absolutely still and then immediately, involuntarily warmer than she had ever seen it. His jaw worked once. He composed himself. He did not cry. His second-in-command would later tell Melissa's maid of honor that Jianwoo had cried in the car on the way to the venue, alone, for approximately 90 seconds, and then composed himself with the efficiency of a man who intended to acknowledge this to no one ever. The triplets were in the ceremony. Zara was a flower girl who took the role with fierce seriousness. Kobe walked Melissa down the aisle because he had asked to, and Jianwoo had said yes before Melissa could even finish parsing the question. Kai stood very still near the officiant and periodically asked the best man quiet questions about the institution of marriage. The vows were private. They had written their own, and they did not share them with anyone afterward. Jianwoo held her hands and said his words in a voice that was very quiet and very steady and absolutely certain, and there were tears on Melissa's face and she didn't try to stop them, and when he finished she said hers, words she had written and rewritten and written again, words that tried to contain the thing she felt for this difficult, beautiful, complicated, loyal man, and she saw his throat move once and his hands tighten on hers. They kissed and the room filled with sound and Zara said loudly and happily from the front row, "There they go again," and the laughter that swept the room was the kind that made everyone in it feel for a moment that the world was genuinely okay. The first year of their marriage was complicated and wonderful and sometimes very hard. There were late nights when his other world reached into their domestic one, and she had to be stronger than she wanted to be. There were adjustments. A man who had lived alone for a decade learning to share his space with one woman and 3 children who had each other's specific chaos. There was a house now, a beautiful house in Forest Hill with a yard that Zara approved of, and there were school runs and client dinners and nights where she fell asleep before he came home and mornings where he left before she woke, and they learned the specific gravity of choosing each other across a busy life. But there was also Sunday mornings where he made coffee and she made pancakes and all 5 of them ate together with the radio on. There was the afternoon she came home and found him on the living room floor, building a Lego castle with the children, with the total focused dedication he brought to everything, a complex engineering project. The children crouched around him like satellites. There was the night the power went out in a storm, and they put the children to bed by candlelight and sat on the kitchen floor for 2 hours talking, really talking the way people do in the dark when there's nothing else demanding their attention. There was the night he told her everything. The real everything. The full architecture of what he was and how it had been built and what it required. He did it in the kitchen, very late, sitting across from her at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on hers, and he did not soften any of it or make any apologies that were not genuine, and when he was done, she sat with it. She said, "Are the children safe?" "Yes." "Am I safe?" "I would burn down every other thing before I let anything reach you." She believed him. She had always believed him. She breathed. She nodded. "Then we continue," she said. "But nothing comes inside this house. The children don't know. We are, in here, just us." "Yes," he said immediately. "Always." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned over and held hers. In the spring they took their first family vacation. Japan, Jianwoo's choice and also his gift because he wanted to give them his world, the part of him that existed before Canada, before Park Industries, before the weight of his inheritance. They went to Kyoto for a week. The children were 5 now, old enough to be awestruck by the right things, and they walked through temple gardens with them and ate ramen at small counters, and the children wore little yukata that a shop owner in Gion had insisted on, delighted by them, and Jianwoo took a photograph of all 3 of his children in their yukata outside a temple, and Melissa took a photograph of him doing it. The CEO, the Mafia boss, the cold billionaire, crouching down to get a better angle on a photo of 3 5-year-olds in traditional Japanese robes, and it was the photograph she kept on her bedside table for the rest of her life. In Kyoto they had one evening alone. Mrs. Park, Sr., Jeonwoo's mother, who had come around to Melissa with the specific speed of a woman who had decided she wanted grandchildren, and here were three of them, fully assembled, took the triplets for the evening. Jeonwoo took Melissa to a restaurant on the hillside of Higashiyama, with a view of the city spread below in the dusk, all those lights, and they ate and drank sake and talked about everything and nothing, and at some point he said, with the look he had when he was saying something he'd thought about for a long time, "I was afraid I would be like my grandfather. That I would be so good at hardens, I would have nothing else." She looked at him. "You're not," she said. "Because of you," he said. "Because of them." "Because it was already there," she said. "I just made it safe to come out." He looked at her across the restaurant table in the Kyoto evening, and his face did that thing she loved most, all the architecture of his coldness simply falling away, just a man, just hers, just present, and he said, "I love you, Melissa Park." "I love you, Jeonwoo," she said. He leaned across the small table and kissed her, softly, in the Kyoto evening, with the city lights coming on below them one by one. Their second vacation was to Barbados for the summer, when the triplets turned 6. Kobe learned to body surf. Zara befriended the woman at the resort who sold handmade jewelry and talked her into teaching her to make a bracelet. Kai sat at the water's edge for long stretches of time and Jeonwoo sat beside him, and when Melissa took a photograph of them from a distance, her husband and her quietest child, side by side at the edge of the Caribbean, two people who processed the world through the same deep interior channel, she had to look away for a moment because she felt it all too much. Jeonwoo swam with the children. He, who had been raised not to play, who had been trained out of play before most people have finished learning it, he swam with 3 6-year-olds and let Kobe splash him directly in the face and said, "Again," which was the most joyful word she had ever heard him say. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the balcony of their room in the warm Caribbean dark, the sea below them invisible but audible, the stars enormous. "This is the life," Melissa said. Not a question. Just a recognition. "Yes," he said. He was holding her hand. He brought it to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a habit of his she had come to love with a particular intensity, the deliberateness of it, the way it was always a choice. This is exactly it. They had a daughter the year the triplets turned 7. They named her Hannah, the Korean word for one, but also a name that simply meant flower in the way names can mean more than one thing at once. She came into the world in the same Toronto hospital where Melissa had her appendix removed, which felt right, circular, the city giving her things and then giving her more things. Jeonwoo was in the delivery room because of course he was. The man who had signed a surgical consent form at 1 a.m. was absolutely not going to be anywhere else. He held Melissa's hand through the whole of it and at no point did he flinch or make the experience about himself or say anything other than exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. And when Hannah arrived and was placed in his arms for the first time, his face went through something so private and total that Melissa looked away to give him the moment. He brought the triplets to meet their sister the next morning. Zara immediately declared herself in charge of teaching Hannah things. Kobe poked the baby's hand until she grabbed his finger, and then couldn't stop grinning about it. Kai looked at Hannah for a very long time and then said, "She has your nose, Dad," and Jeonwoo's face, "Dad," he'd said Dad with the total casualness of someone who had been saying it his whole life, did something extraordinary and Melissa reached over and took his hand and he held hers hard and none of them spoke for a moment. Life was not always easy. He was who he was, and the world he operated in had textures that were sometimes ugly and sometimes dangerous, and there were nights of fear and nights of anger and the specific difficulty of two strong people with two different kinds of armor learning, again and again to take the armor off in front of each other. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that required two people to sit with the uncomfortable truth of themselves and come back to each other, and there were silences that were hard before they became comfortable again. But there was always the kitchen on Sunday mornings. There was always Kai's impossible questions and Kobe's irresistible optimism and Zara's terrifying competence and Hannah, growing up in the middle of all of it, absorbing her parents and her siblings and becoming somehow all of them and entirely herself. There was a dog, eventually, Kobe lobbied for 3 consecutive years and prevailed, a large brown dog named Rambo who Jeonwoo initially described as unnecessary and was, within 2 months, taking on early morning walks without being asked. There was the waterfront always. They went back every year, the 6 of them, to the place where they had kissed in the wind, where their story had come together in the simple physical fact of her slipping on ice and him catching her. The children grew. The waterfront remained. The lake stayed large and gray and endless. "What are you thinking?" she asked him one evening there. The children were teenagers now, or nearly, the triplets at 12, Hannah at 5, running around with the dog while the older 3 stood at the railing with the particular intense privacy of adolescence. The city hummed behind them. The lake stretched ahead. He looked at her. He always looked at her this way, still after all this time, like she was a thing he had not yet finished being surprised by. That night you called me, he said. I called you by accident, she reminded him. I know. He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, warm and deliberate. The most important call of my life, and you dialed the wrong number. He shook his head slightly, something like wonder in his voice. You dialed the wrong number and you saved me. She looked at him. You came to the hospital in the middle of the night, she said. You made eggs for my children. You signed the form. She shook her head too, soft and wondering. You were already saving yourself. I was just the occasion. He made a sound, low, amused, a little undone. He pulled her toward him and pressed his lips to her temple, and she leaned into his side, and in front of them the lake was enormous and gray and the city lights were beginning to come on, and behind them their children's voices rose and fell in the cold Toronto air, and the dog barked at something, and Hannah shrieked with laughter, and Zara's voice said, with 15 years of accumulated authority, Rambo, leave it, and Jeonwoo's arm around her shoulders was warm and real and entirely without armor. This was a life. Not a simple one. Not a safe one exactly. Not the life that either of them had planned or predicted or could have imagined finding in this gray, glittering, cold, beloved city. But it was theirs. All of it. The wrong number was dialed at midnight. The surgical consent form was signed by a man with no obligation. The eggs on 3 plates, each with a slice of orange. The red crayon. The waterfront kiss in the Lake Ontario wind. The ring in the wrong drawer. The vows were said quietly. The children are growing. The dog. The daughter. The Sunday mornings and the hard nights and the jazz records and the Korean soup. All of it. Every complicated, dramatic, cold beginning, warm becoming piece of it. Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support for this channel always. See you in the next story.